Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar entitled The Student Body of One by One, Leveraging Personalized Learning in K-12 Schools Using Innovative Practices for Curriculum Planning and Development. My name is Sean Melia and I'll be your host for today's webinar. I am the Vice President of Sales and Subscriber Services from McGraw-Hill Education. Today we'll be hearing from Jason Green, our Executive Director of School Programs, as well as our Chief Academic Officer, Dr. Sean Mahoney. Like many school leaders, you may be actively researching or implementing personalized learning, looking at innovative curricula and instructional technology, all with the goal of empowering educators to create highly effective student-centered learning environments. Our experts will be discussing strategies and ideas along these lines. But before I hand it over to Jason, let's review some of the technical aspects of today's presentation. First, if you guys are having audio trouble, please check the audio setting on your computer as well as your speaker volume settings. If you are still having issues, please review the audio troubleshooting file available in the resource list beneath the Q&A window. There's also some helpful icons located at the bottom of the webinar console that open additional feature panels, and you can read about today's speakers in the speaker bio panel and access the resource list to download a copy of today's slides. During the presentations, please submit your questions by typing them in the Q&A box located above the resource list window. We will have a brief Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And finally, an on-demand replay for today's presentation will be available online in the next 24 hours. Both the archive and a free-to-download version of the PowerPoint deck will be accessible through edweek.org. Now back to our speakers. As I mentioned, Dr. Mahoney, our Chief Academic Officer, and her team are focused on the academic design and academic integrity for learning experiences, including the strategy for learning outcomes with the McGraw-Hill Education's digital learning system. Sean's previous positions include the Vice President of School Product Design, Research, and Advocacy, and she was the co-founder of the Idea Innovation Center. Jason T. Green is the Executive Director of School Programs for McGraw-Hill Education. Jason is the co-author of the new book, Blended Learning in Action, and as a social entrepreneur, Jason has spent his career creating opportunities to effectuate positive change in education with expertise in blended learning, one-to-one, and flipped classroom models. Prior to joining McGraw-Hill Education, Jason was an executive at Redbird Learning and also served as president of Advanced Classrooms. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Jason Green. Welcome, Jason.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sean. Very, very excited to be here and be part of this webinar. As Sean mentioned, both Sean Mahoney and I are going to be speaking with you about the idea of one-to-one learning and truly leveraging what is possible now with personalization and personalized learning. My portion is going to focus on establishing first common language so that we're all, when we're saying certain words, meaning the same thing, and then talking about some of the best practices and evidence of best practice of personalized and one-to-one implementations. Before diving in, I would love to invite those of you who are listening to connect with me. I'm a big believer in connected educators. I'm on Twitter regularly at Jason Todd Green. For those of you who are using Twitter, definitely reach out. Would love to build my PLN. And I also invite you to participate in an ongoing slow chat at hashtag BLInAction, which stands for Blended Learning in Action. That's the short form for the book name. That's an ongoing conversation about best practices of blended learning, tips, research, and evidence from a number of educators around the world on how they're implementing blended learning. So as I mentioned, I want to start this conversation with a brief discussion of just building and establishing some common language. One of the things that I found as a key challenge is right now in education there's a lot of buzzwords, and what we're finding is that people might be using the same word and meaning actually two different things. For the purposes of this conversation, there's 4 terms that I want to establish as common language. The first is the term differentiation, a very common term in education, which refers to the teacher driving instruction and adjusting learning needs for groups of students. The second term is individualization, where the teacher still is the driver of instruction, but accommodates learning needs for an individual learner. And of course, our key word for today, personalization, where the learner and the teacher collaborate to drive learning and determine the needs, plan, and the design for the learner. So in essence, personalized learning is like differentiation and individualization in that they each provide different learning experiences in regards to three key areas. The first of which is content, where students can be in the same classroom, potentially in working on the same subject area, but actually dealing with different content based upon what the learner needs. They're also similar in that it can be differentiation, individualization, or personalization in how different students are actually learning, the actual modality that they're using to learn whatever the skill, whatever the concept is. And third, they're similar in that there could be differences in the output, right? What is the actual evidence of learning and how are students demonstrating what they've learned? For those educators out there that are familiar with UDL, Universal Design for Learning, this is very, very familiar conversation about how learners can be in the same space, even during the same time, but learning different content, learning it in different ways, and also demonstrating in different methods how they're actually learning. Personalization, however, adds something different to this conversation. And the key here is that it becomes more student-centered and increases student agency. So a term that we're hearing more and more and seeing more and more is this idea of choice and voice, where the learner is actually taking on, in many ways, greater ownership in choosing what they're learning, how they're learning, and the learner's voice is coming through much more in that process. Another key part of personalization is that the learner becomes a co-planner and co-creator of their learning methods, even of their learning content. So what can this look like? First of all, it can actually involve planning and design conferences between the student and the teacher, where students are actually involved in planning and design how they're learning. It can also involve ongoing formative assessments, where the student is authentically involved in owning their data. And the third piece, a good example, is student learning portfolios, where we're seeing more and more where students have a chance to get both real-time and ongoing reflections of their learning, self-assessments, and demonstrations of their learning. This is all part of how personalization is really pushing this idea of how students are engaging more deeply in their own learning process. The final term that I want to cover is actually a term that's near and dear to my heart, and that's blended learning. So thanks to the Christensen Institute, who has developed what has been accepted as the most widely known and utilized definition of blended learning, we now have a way to actually understand and be on the same page when we talk about what actually is blended learning. So let's go through that briefly. A formal education program in which a student learns, at least in part, through online learning with some element of student control over time, place, path, and or pace. So right there, we're incorporating the idea of agency that's also found in personalization, at least in part in a supervised brick and mortar location away from home. So this is where the blended part comes in, where students do have an opportunity to work with a facilitator, a teacher, generally in, as it says, a brick and mortar location. And the third one is very important and discusses how modalities along each student's learning path within a course or subject are connected to provide an integrated learning experience. This is key because what this basically means is, in the truest form, a blended environment is one where the different modalities, elements of how a student is learning are actually connected. So it's not as if a student's learning one thing in class and it's entirely separate, entirely disconnected what they may be doing independently. We're not going to have a chance in this webinar to go into the models But know that the 4 key models that are emerging in blended learning are the rotation station, flex model, a la carte model, and then an enriched virtual model. As Sean Millian mentioned in the introduction, I recently published a book. I co-authored a book, Blended Learning in Action, with Catlin Tucker and Tiffany Wyckoff. What we did was, in this book, we said, how do we help to begin to make blended learning much more tangible as far as how it can look when it's actually implemented most effectively in classrooms? So what we came up with is this idea of the PAC, which are basically hallmarks of effective blended learning. So as you can see, it starts with personalization, which we just covered. It includes agency, this idea that students are owning more of their learning process. It also involves audience. We call this authentic audience, where students and learners are having more and more opportunities to engage with the real world, to engage with an audience for their learning that goes beyond just the teacher. Connectivity, which involves, of course, connecting with peers, connecting with experts, connecting with the global community, which is now very possible through technology. And also creativity, where students have real opportunities to leverage more creativity in their learning process. What we found is in the most effective blended implementations, you'll see these hallmarks actually present in classrooms. Usually it may not be all 5, but it'll be 1, it'll be 2, it'll be 3. But as teachers are becoming more versed and more comfortable in leveraging technology in classrooms, we're seeing more of this taking place. For those of you who have done work with the SAMR model, what this moves us to is deeper levels of modification, deeper levels of redefinition, which are essentially the highest levels of SAMR. To make it even more crystal clear, I want to bring up an example of a particular student project that one of our colleagues, a good friend, Darren Elwin, who's the principal of Harrisburg South Middle School in South Dakota, had his students do a project where they were actually thinking about how to actually address the plastic pollution challenge in oceans. This project, very uniquely, was able to incorporate multiple hallmarks of blended learning, starting with creativity. Students had a chance to create their own solutions, connectivity. They worked together to collaborate on these solutions. Authentic audience. Students used Flipgrid to create videos of their solutions, which were then reviewed by experts. Agency, where students had a large say in how they were going to go about their project. So there are certain examples where schools are now getting very creative in how they're leveraging more and more aspects of blended learning, and specifically these various hallmarks. So to close out this part of the conversation, the way that we look at blended learning and personalization in relation to each other is blended learning is a pathway towards personalization, and personalization is a hallmark of an effective blended learning implementation. So blended being the modality, personalization being the what actually comes out when blended learning is well implemented. With all that being said, there's still a lot of debate. There are a number of educators that still have questions around personalization. Dan Willingham, who makes the argument that learning is cumulative and students may not pick the best path for their learning. So if you give students too much control over their learning process, as personalization kind of, is pushing us towards that, students may not necessarily know or choose the best path for themselves. Dan Meyer, a renowned math educator, makes the argument and brings up the concern that too much personalization may actually reduce the necessary social aspects of learning. If students are too engrossed in their own path, will they still get the benefit of what you can learn in collaboration in more social settings? And Ben Riley makes the argument that thinking in and of itself is hard, and students may not choose the more challenging but sometimes necessary path. The brain is actually designed not to work. The brain is actually designed to find the most efficient route. And so what that means is if students are then in a position where they're having to choose too much of their path, maybe they won't choose the right path and they'll go the easy route. These are all very legitimate challenge points, which I think brings up a key element of why personalization needs to also be buttressed with a conversation around balance. And especially when you start to talk about technology. The way that I think we address these issues is the teacher as the facilitator needs to have a key and vital role in making sure that the scaffolding that needs to happen within learning is not just up to the student, but the teacher is guiding that process. We've already talked about collaboration and socialization, how students need to have significant experiences within that. And of course, the teacher needs to play a vital role in making sure that students aren't in a position to take the easy way out of a learning process. What we've also found is that the conversation about personalization is not helped when you see a number of implementations that have taken the very traditional classroom. You guys see here a picture of the common picture of an old classroom that is very teacher-centered, very passive approaches to learning that really focused on primarily auditory as the modality of learning. And what we thought was that when technology came, that we were going to have more of a chance for students to do more creation, have more agency, have more ownership. But what really happened was learning design itself in many instances did not itself change, and learning still was very teacher-centered, very single modal. And so technology did not necessarily create this transformational shift that we were hoping that it would have. It doesn't mean it can't happen. And so the last portion of this discussion for me, I want to talk about where the opportunities are after working and having a chance to experience literally hundreds of school districts that are facing these challenges. I see significant opportunities where personalization can happen, where districts and classrooms and teachers can do very important things to make it more possible. The first is we must ensure that systems are integrated and simplified for ease of use and optimization of learning. And that goes for both the teachers and the learners. We must also begin to rethink curriculum and school design so that they actively work toward personalization. And the third piece is we need to really figure out and think about how to make the school a true learning community. So let's unpack these a little bit. What we know now is that in any learning experience, especially in today's classrooms, which are heavily endowed with technology, that at this point, there might be 5, 6, 7 different types of technology that are impacting and influencing the teaching and learning experience. There's the LMS, there's probably some form of digital content, also some form of print content, there's data tools, there's apps and tools, there's devices, of course, then there's productivity suites like G Suite or Microsoft 365. Each one of these tools, each one of these elements now of learning has the potential to make a great impact on learning, but they also have the potential, if they don't work well together, to create some serious headaches for teachers. One of the challenges here in simplifying systems and integrating systems is that these decisions tend to be made way before a teacher ever experiences any of these in the actual classroom. And unfortunately, these decisions often are made in silos. So what that basically means is, if these systems aren't integrated, a teacher may have to communicate through an LMS that doesn't speak to the data tools where he or she is trying to actually access data. And in even some cases, we've seen places where a school district might be using Google for Education as their productivity suite, but Microsoft 365 as their email program. So what that basically means is teachers are losing valuable instructional time, tools are going underutilized, learning is for sure not optimized, and there's a significant degree of frustration amongst teachers. So the first thing that I see as a win and opportunity for districts is making sure that these decisions that are made around systems are decisions that allow for more integration so that teachers can spend their time on the most important work of actually facilitating learning. The second piece I want to talk about briefly is curriculum and school design. This is another important one because if you think about how most of the current structures of schools are set up, they're actually set up to work against personalization. When we think about scope and sequence, whole group models of instruction, the grading requirements that teachers and students have to follow, most of these structures actually work against personalization. We're asking teachers to actually come off script and in many cases work against the tools that we're given, work against the structures that we're given to then implement personalized learning. And so it's important, I think, for those on the phone, districts, whether it's school principals, district leadership, to really have a hard look at the systems that are currently in place and how we're telling teachers and asking them to do more personalization, but actually having systems that they're trying to work with that are actively working against personalization. Just to give a couple of examples of some of the things we're seeing out there, because the good news here is that in almost every school I've been in, almost every single district, there are teachers that are trailblazers that are really pushing through and doing creative things to make learning much more personalized. So first of all, thinking about linear learning and curriculum, this goes to the scope and sequence. We're seeing more and more the leveraging of adaptive and self-paced supplemental curriculum. Sean Mahoney is going to talk about this shortly. This is where students have a chance to do more personalization within one-to-one models. We're even seeing more radical models like a completely performance-based education system. A good example of this is Taylor County in Kentucky under Superintendent Roger Cook. He's created a system where it doesn't matter what age, grade level a student's supposed to be in, the entire system is now built around students being able to be in courses that meet the needs of where they are right now. That's a much more radical shift, but districts can learn by taking pieces from some of these models that are out there, really innovating on personalization. Schedule and space. Remember the classroom that we showed earlier. If you're buying technology but not also thinking about the redesign of classrooms, you're going to be limited in what actually can take place from the technology. So even in shifting to models like classroom rotation, which is happening in a number of places, even whole group rotation, which we talk about in our book, can begin to really push on how scheduling, how school spaces, classroom spaces can be redesigned to heighten personalized learning. Going back to Harrisburg Middle School that I talked about earlier, there students even have a choice in how learning spaces are designed. This, in large part, creates a tremendous amount of student agency. And if you think about, let's say, moving class schedules into more block schedules, where teachers have more time to go deeper into material, then you're creating space for teachers to be able to leverage technology, do more personalization. The time and support for teachers. Tech coaches and principals and instructional leadership need to be in a position where teachers are able to get real-life examples of what personalization looks like. In a few minutes, I'll talk briefly about a great example of this in Rio Public Schools that was able to actually shift the district's mindset and culture by helping teachers become truly blended learners themselves so that they're now in a better position to not just know and see what personalization is, how to do it through blended learning, but now that they're actually practicing it in the classroom. And finally, systems around assessments and progress measuring. This is a big one, and there are some very trailblazing teachers, one of which is my co-author, Caitlin Tucker. Another one is Star Saxby. I have their Twitter handles here that you all can see, where teachers are now really questioning the ways in which data is managed, the way in which grades are actually used. My co-author, Caitlin Tucker, has made a major shift in her classroom where she's now bringing all of the assessments that she's doing into the classroom. So in essence, She's creating a space using technology. One example is using Google Docs, where she's able to edit and correct students' work live. What that means is instead of a feedback loop being a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks or more, the feedback loop is now instantaneous. And students don't make the same error for a week or 2 weeks before they get feedback. They can make an error one time, she can make the correction and keep on moving. These are some of the ways that we're seeing teachers, school leadership, and even whole districts begin to address some of the structural challenges that are getting in the way of true personalized learning. And finally, the school-led learning community. What we know is that teachers for too long have been subjects of professional learning that really hasn't met the mark for what they need. And it's also been very much rooted in very traditional forms of learning. What we also know is that every teacher, just like every student, is different. And so part of what we've pushed to do, I had a chance to spend the last 4 years doing research at Stanford, really looking at effective models of professional learning. And what we found is professional development needs to be as personalized as it is for teachers, as it is for students. When you think about what a tech enthusiast or visionary might need, it's very different from what a pragmatist or conservative might need, and for sure from a skeptic. Where we're finding most districts getting held up is in this chasm where bringing pragmatists and conservatives into the fold is a real challenge. I want to speak briefly about Rio Public Schools. I mentioned them earlier. Superintendent John Puglisi spent the last 3 years in implementing a technology initiative where he's taken the entire school district and moved that school district from a very traditional mode and approach to learning to a true 21st century learning environment. And in large part, it was because he, as the lead learner, was able to build a culture where teachers viewed themselves as learners as well. A couple ways in which that happened was they began to gamify PD and make it actually a very personalized experience. Teachers had a chance to earn badges and points in their PD structure. We worked with them through our Redbird McGraw-Hill professional learning platform, where teachers had the seat of a blended learner. They were choosing their own path. They were identifying the pace at which they could actually learn new material. They made PD fun. Teachers began to go out to conferences and come back and present information and material back to their colleagues. And finally, they incentivized teachers. If teachers were going through the program and doing the learning, they had a chance to earn rewards, earn points, some very small, some larger. But the point of it is they were able to shift a culture where teachers ultimately became the 21st century learners that we're asking them to help create. And with that, those are the areas and the items that I've seen districts that have been able to pull off very impactful transformational shifts towards personalized learning, conduct themselves in such a way that each of those elements was actually present. So again, I invite you to connect with me on Twitter at Jason Todd Green, and I invite you to our ongoing book chat at BL in Action. And I'd like to now turn it over to Sean Mahoney, who will be discussing deeper into the one-on-one models themselves. Sean?
Super. Thank you so much, Jason. One of the things I always appreciate about Jason is his commitment to clarity of communication. So whether it's common vocabulary and establishing that up front, or the clarity around 5 hallmarks of blended learning, or even anchoring the work in the classroom examples, I always find it very refreshing. So thank you, Jason. And I'd also like to just take a minute to thank Ed Week for bringing us all together. And at the risk of sounding repetitive, I want to thank all of you for devoting time to engage with us. As someone who's spent time in the classroom as a teacher and at the district as a curriculum specialist and held many roles as an educator, I understand the value of your time. So I thank you so much for your interest in this topic and really thinking with us about how we can optimize learning experiences through the notion of personalized learning. Much like Jason, I would invite you to continue the discussion after the webinar. So you can see my Twitter handle here on screen with a hashtag that we often use to really focus on that intention of purposeful learning. I want to actually quote Jason back to all of us and bridge to the next portion of the discussion and pick up on the theme of the importance of teachers, which is really about mindfulness and meaning and setting context in the classroom. One of the things that we will often say at McGraw-Hill Education, and I deeply believe is key and important to classroom success and student success and the overall education system, is empowering great teaching. And I believe that the power of a great teacher and an educator is that they can introduce you to yourself and to your mind and to new notions in a powerful way that expands your world and your options and choices. So it's with that I would actually like to start to think about the power and importance of great teaching in relationship and in context to teaching with technology. And to my mind, I thought it might be interesting to start with a story about caterpillars and butterflies. And as odd as that may sound, it occurs to me that the butterfly is still an insect. Right? So when we think about caterpillars and we think about butterflies, they have similarities, and yet the butterfly is still an insect, it's just one that flies. And that's one type of transformation. And another form or an example of transformation that I can think of is with parents. When someone becomes a mother or a father, all of a sudden they begin to think differently. They're providers and they're responsible for someone else's life. They have a responsibility to help the child achieve a higher sense of self or a high understanding of self. I can think of other examples of transformation, like when we began to move from the medium of plays to movies. And at first, if you look back at the history of film, they were really enacted like plays. They sort of faded up on screen like the curtain, or they were closed out in a circle. And yet with this new medium of film came different camera techniques and different editing techniques. And yet at its core, it was still about telling a story. So the question at the heart of that medium really became, how did they take advantage of technology to enhance the medium? So similarly in education, I think about, at our core, we are experts in learning and pedagogy, and the medium may be transforming with the introduction of educational technologies. You may not necessarily touch it in the same way or feel it in the same way or sit with it in the same way. So for example, we may go from producing and utilizing textbooks that sit on the shelf for 5 to 10 years to producing data-enabled modular content that can iterate and really be interspersed and reenacted. Overheads at one time were emerging technology. So this notion of educational transformation through technology is not different. The digital age is not something to fear, but rather it's really to think about this idea of transformation and how we optimize it. So to my mind, as we proceed, the question is really about, how does the medium help us approach the work differently? And as one of my mentors in this space, Christine, asks, what are the affordances and limitations of technology? It's really about purpose and meaning. So in that context, I'm hoping that we'll accomplish 3 things with our time together. So one is really to look at an outline of an approach to research and design in education, including research and design for personalized learning. Second, I want to have us walk through some exemplars, as Jason alluded to, of personalized learning that is deeply rooted in research, in practice, and that's really related to how we're transforming and approaching the work differently and taking appropriate advantage of the medium itself. And then finally, we'll spend some time introducing a couple of principles and frameworks. I think Sean Mealy talked about them as strategies and ideas, for example, that we believe are helpful to extend and enhance your goals. And I do want to honor the fact that I think we have a variety of folks wearing a lot of different hats, so classroom teachers, curriculum directors, CTOs, and so I would really encourage and challenge you to think about how the principles and the key questions that we're going to engage in, and I will invite you to use the group chat at certain points here, play out and are customized to your particular role. In that context, I thought it might be helpful to share a bit about how we contextualize our work in our role within academic design and instructional material design at McGraw-Hill Education. So you may have started to pick up on a theme here, that it is all about the learner and learning. Our vision is to unlock the full potential of each learner and to do so in a way that is engaging and efficient and effective in those experiences and fundamentally grounded in research. That's key. And in fact, at McGraw-Hill Education and in my role, our teams believe that it's that focus intersection between the science of learning and the art of teaching where the magic happens. So this notion of really focusing on how learning happens and how the mind develops is where we see the act and the aspiration of all these elements of learning coming together. So you heard me use this phrase, the science of learning serving the art of teaching. We believe that that is where great teaching can flourish, and that researchers play a part in this work, that students play a part, teachers play a unique role, parents, and yet we all come together playing those parts and are part of the overall symphony, if you will. So the first chance that I'd like to offer everyone to interact is around this essential question. And so I'd like to pose this question to the group, and you can feel free to respond by entering 1 or 2 words or a short phrase in the group chat window over the next 30 seconds or so. And the group chat is actually in an icon at the bottom of the screen. And the question here is, what is the nature of learning? Right? It's kind of a broad question. It's intended to be so. But if you want to jot down 1 or 2 words, a couple of short phrases that to your mind speak to the nature of learning and critical elements, we'll reflect on that as we go forward. One of the aspects of a careful and intentional learning experience, and I'm starting to see some great responses come through saying that the nature of learning is connected and it's curious and it's reflective. So this notion of inquiry and a deep personal connection and ownership and discovery is really coming up, which is why we're moving on this screen to the notion of research, this idea of careful and intentional balance between discovery about what we know about effectively designed experiences and well-grounded research experiences that are then validated and tuned to inform implementation. Right? So what you're seeing on screen here is a research lifecycle that we use here at McGraw-Hill Education that helps us optimize learning experiences. And if we unpack what you're seeing on screen, in the middle of the diagram, you're seeing kind of the basic phases of any solution or design experience. So those of you who are familiar with instructional design and the ADDIE model, for example, you'll see from moving on the left-hand side, there's discovery. You've got a question all the way to the right-hand side, which is implementation at scale. And above that are different types of research and methodologies that you can pair with each phase. And then below that are different types of data, experiences, and user research that can be conducted. And so what you're seeing here is a way to break down this notion of exploration and discovery by way of well-rounded, well-grounded, validated research solutions. To make it very specific, in our context, we actually believe that learning science can drive continuous improvement in learning ecosystems. And whether you think of a learning ecosystem as the platform that you might be using, whether you think of the learning ecosystem as your classroom proper or your district learning ecosystem, this notion of a purposeful plan for personalized learning is key. So what you're seeing on screen here is the idea that, number one, to kind of borrow from Jason's lesson, we're establishing a common vocabulary around learning science. So for us, learning science you can think of as an interdisciplinary field that draws on multiple theoretical perspectives and research paradigms. And it's in service of advancing knowledge and the application of knowledge about learning. So you can think of this as educational psychologists coming together with computer scientists, coming together perhaps with cognitive psychologists, coming together with professional development experts, for instance. That would be an example of a learning science research community that kind of moves through the cycle you're seeing on screen, where there are these components around research and methodology and pedagogy and design and evidence-based design and analytics that really enliven and enhance the overall experience. And one note that I often think is important to make here around the notion of data, particularly when we're talking about taking advantages of the affordances of technology, is that we think it's deeply important to respect data, including the security and privacy of data. So you will often hear folks within our organization talk about small data and the idea that it's really related to the teaching and learning moment and optimizing that learning objective or that learning aim. So when we think about the purpose of learning, what you're seeing here on screen is a saying that one of our teachers often reflects back to us, which is that we enter each new phase of life as a novice. And to my mind, it's all the more reason why this idea of discovery and a balance between research and design in education, in educational technology that is optimizing personalized solutions is all the more important. So it's the cycle of asking questions, seeking new understanding, and applying what you learn, right? Question, test, and apply. And it's that iterative research process that's at the heart of inquiry. And for us, it's what allows folks, when we see successful implementations of personalized learning plans, to really approach the work thinking about the why behind the what. So I actually was looking at some of the questions that were submitted in advance, and Deborah had asked a question about how we actually make sure that we're focusing on answering why a particular technology is needed. And I thought that was a really astute question. The idea that there are key questions like, what is the outcome that we're seeking, and what evidence will we actually utilize related to our success towards that outcome? What are our key performance indicators? What are leading indicators? What are lagging indicators? How are we defining success? What is our hypothesis about what effective personalized learning looks like and sounds like in our classrooms? How will we, and this is really important, revise our understanding both as we learn more, right, as we move from novice to master, but also as we mature over time. So it's really about a growth mindset when you think about research and design in your particular context, whether that's at the classroom level, the school level, or the district level. So I want to pose question number 2, and we're sort of building on one another. So we started with this idea of what is the nature of learning. The second question, to which I also invite you to respond and go ahead and enter 1 or 2 words or short phrase in that group chat window at the bottom, is what are the attributes of personalized learning? What are the attributes of personalized learning? And we're kind of picking up on some of the personalization definitions that Jason introduced. But think carefully about when you have experienced either yourself as a learner or as an educator, the attributes of personalized learning environments, what do those include? And as those start to come in, what I want to share are a couple of exemplars. So the next screen, and I see some excellent responses that are right on target, self-directed, empowered, student-centered. What we're about to look at on screen is an example of truly personalized paths through learning. So I am giving you forewarning that this looks incredibly complicated when it goes on screen. And I promise there is not a pop quiz, and I promise that I will break it down. So what you're seeing on screen here is an example of where, to my mind, not all tools are created equal. What you're seeing is an example of the intelligence in Alex, which is a personalized adaptive solution for students, where essentially you can think of it as my path through the learning experience would be very different than Jason's, for example, and it would be based on our individual needs. And what's happening in this particular example is at the very top in the center, you can see a blue box with a blue stroke around it. That's the problem set or the equation. And at the very bottom, if you kind of draw a line straight down, you can see a small box with a green stroke around it. And that's the solution or the correct answer. And what's happening in that entire network are all of the ways that students effectively went about solving that problem. And so what's happening in the middle section of this screen are the most frequently utilized methods that students went about solving that equation. What's happening on the fringes are all of the other additional equally valid ways that students went about problem solving. So one of the reasons why I use this as an example is because I really do think that it brings to light that balance between research and design, and illustrates a few key points about how we are leveraging the medium to enhance our work. So number one, this is an excellent example of utilizing the capabilities of technology to enhance understanding about what is typically invisible in the learning process. Right? We have millions of queries against these types of equations, and this is just one problem that shows us all of the ways that students are approaching solving this problem. Second, it's an excellent example about why we have to be humble about the creativity that students use and what we capture in those cases. So it's not just about utilizing technology that's going to allow us to sort of map the world of knowledge, but doing so in a way that it's constantly teaching and updating itself, because students are going to very creatively get from A to B, both metaphorically and literally, in unimaginable and enhanced ways. And we want to be able to recognize and reward that learning pattern. And then finally, it's a way to use technology to inform and optimize those personalized paths and progression that we talked about. So based on research, we have this network map of ways and places that students might go next, or next plus one, based on how they respond. So to me, it's a perfect example of that transformation, right? Working differently and taking advantage of the medium in the appropriate way to support learning and empower great teaching. So it's absolutely, as I see in the chat window, about tailoring to an individual student's needs on a very granular learning objective level. Similarly, one of the examples that we often talk about is with Redbird mathematics, and it's an exemplar of a research-based approach designed to prepare educators for 21st century learning. And specifically, there are 4 different aspects that are important to highlight. So number one, and I'm sort of alluding to the content that you can see in the red circles on screen here, is that Redbird mathematics takes advantages of the affordances of technology related to patterns of response. So the learning pathways adjust automatically and offer remediation or acceleration. So again, Jason's path would be very different than mine, both based on patterns of responses and our overall understanding. Second, it's a way to really introduce and take advantage of multimedia to drive both interactivity and student progress. The third element is really around, to my mind, differentiation. It's about multiple modes of instruction that support individual student needs. And I know we got several questions in advance about how do you tailor instruction to support those individual student needs. Well, there's always a place for, remember, the science of learning serving the art of teaching. There's always a place for the professional judgment of the teacher and for the teacher to customize and tune. And yet, if we can do anything to lighten the load and provide, the last circle on this screen, actionable insights and real-time data to teachers based on an objective level performance for students, it enhances that teaching and learning cycle. So when I think about sort of summarizing, the attributes of a personalized learning system, it is not just about having a tool, right? Personalized learning plans, including the tools that you employ them, are most effective when they're purposeful. So it's not the tool, it's the right tool at the right time for the right student for the right reason. Don't lead with devices, lead with the learning. We will say that over and over again. Time and time again, we've worked with schools and districts who led with a device strategy rather than leading with a learning strategy or a personalized learning strategy. It's about purposeful learning, and when you have those conversations anchoring the teaching and learning discussions, it's where we see schools and districts having the most success. The third element and kind of essential question that I want us to come around is this idea of frameworks and principles. So again, I invite you to respond, 1 or 2 words, key references, or even links, because this really is about frameworks and principles that you utilize to extend your personalized learning strategy. And when I think about principles, I think of them as sort of propositions that are the foundation for a system or a chain of reasoning, right? So you have a theory of action or a chain of thought, and what are the principles that underlie that work? So some frameworks and principles. Jason talked about the SAMR model, for example, earlier. It's starting to approach the notion of different principles and frameworks. So we'll monitor the chat window as these come through, and as they are, we'll give you a couple of examples of principles and frameworks that we utilize and have found to be effective in this work around personalization. The first one is guiding principles for English learners, specifically related to English language acquisition. And this is actually hot off the presses, so hot off the presses that it is pre-publication, so I'm sort of flashing an early view at a principle-based approach to supporting English language learners. So when we talk about research-based, as you well know, this is an area of differentiation and support that is critical for our learners and for our teachers. It's one of the fastest growing student populations in the country, and what we have done is work with leading educators and researchers to outline 9 principles like cultivating meaning and teaching structure and form and developing language and context, for example, that are critical in any age, in any stage, in any subject area. So these are common attributes to a personalized learning system and principles that can manifest themselves in ways to help you in a variety and a multitude of implementation scenarios. If you are interested in the full principles guide, please reach out to us and we'll connect with folks outside of the webinar. Another way to think about this is within the entire ecosystem. So we said frameworks and principles. What you're seeing on screen is our approach to thinking about a learning ecosystem. So first of all, kind of unpack what you're seeing here. In that yellow circle is the notion of designed curriculum, right? So you go about research, planning, and designing a curriculum. And then in turquoise, you see that curriculum enacted as it plays out in the realia of classrooms, right? And having spent several years as a bilingual language arts and math teacher in 7th grade, that design curriculum and curriculum enacted is a delicate balance, right? There are always intended and unintended consequences. And so when you're thinking about how the design curriculum and the enacted curriculum come together with formative assessment, it's that which we see as really the virtuous teaching and learning cycle. And so what's happening at the bottom of this screen and thinking about the ecosystem is if you have design curriculum that's being enacted that is integrated with formative assessment, what are some of the inputs and key contributors to that system? So on the bottom left-hand side, you see content experts. So this might be where academic designers or instructional designers are thinking really thoughtfully about optimizing search, for example. So if I'm a teacher and I'm getting ready to plan a 3rd grade science lesson, what's the kind of metadata that McGraw-Hill Education has tagged to multimedia assets so that I can quickly search some of those nonfiction texts by Lifecycle level, or if I want to attend to a certain level of blooms, or if I want to look for all of the hands-on project-based learning. Right? That's something that intentionally has to be designed up front to optimize your search experience. In the middle, you can see examples where, as a teacher, I might want to actually add a resource that I've found online, or something I've created, or something from another program. We think that that is absolutely how you empower a great teacher, and in order to do that, it requires us to think about the ecosystem and creating modular content. Finally, on the right-hand side towards the bottom, you're seeing this notion of personalized paths. So this is getting back to the idea that everything has a learning objective associated with it, that there's targeted learner data to capture around that moment in a technology-based adaptive system, and how you bring all of that back together to provide important professional development around analytics that give actionable information and insights to the teacher within an open ecosystem is really how you enhance the personalized learning experience. So this is one of the frameworks that we use as a core, or really even cornerstone, of how we approach taking advantage of the medium, how you optimize technology. And in that regard, one of the questions that we often ask, both internally and externally, is who can't wait to help us? It's sort of our saying, and it makes us think about what partners are ready to help us succeed, and what are the attributes of those partners. So who is asking smart questions at the building level about your teaching and learning strategy? Who is really trying to deeply understand your goals and your theory of action related to personalized learning. As Jason talks about, can you articulate, and are your partners able to articulate the difference between differentiation and individualization and personalization, and how that plays out across your different subject areas? What we often find is that whether it's organizations like a middle school and a high school working together to, for example, try and increase the level of success around an Algebra 1 course, they share a characteristic, which is they make the partnership more important than any problem. They make the partnership more important than any problem. So in other words, they may say, you know what, we don't share a common placement exam for Algebra 1. How might we go about solving that problem? And they don't let it become insurmountable. They say, we're not going to leave the room until we figure this out. So this is the idea of the best practices really emerging and being reinforced by edifying relationships. So when you're thinking about personalized learning, one of our ideas and strategies and key components to success is really finding the right partner that's going to help you build a sustainable relationship over time, and guarantee you that because of the nature of transformation, there will be bumps and hiccups along the road, but what you want is someone that can help you make the partnership more important than any of those problems that you're going to encounter. So if I kind of think about bringing this to a close and coming back to the notion of the transformation story, at its core, we are all educators who are committed to academically and educationally sound content. And this is our North Star at McGraw-Hill Education. In fact, we have a framework where you can see academic integrity is at the center of it. And absolutely, you see that technology is one of the dimensions, and yet so too is the policy at play, both at your local and national level. The content plays a critical role in terms of enhancing that experience, and how that plays out with your theory of pedagogy. And then what's happening in the diamond is this idea that you have individuals, whether it's individual teachers or individual students, and you have societal expectations as well as professional expectations. So what, for example, are your commitments to the local education agencies related to accommodations and modifications for some of your special learner populations? You have the domain. You have other experts like your local universities who have contributions to make, and all of those folks in the diamond are sort of working together, sometimes in alignment, sometimes out of alignment, but at its core, the academic integrity and that commitment to academically and educationally sound content that is optimized through the medium, right, through this transformative medium, is why we get up out of bed every day. So we said we would talk about 3 things. We're right about at time. We did walk through the research and design, so we talked a little bit about the life cycle and the importance of learning science. We talked a bit about exemplars, so we looked at Alex and Redbird as 2 exemplary personalized learning tools that take advantage of the medium of technology. And then we also said that we wanted to look at some principles and frameworks, which is the EL guide and the ecosystem framework that we utilize to govern our work. So with that, I will, again, thank you for joining us. I will say, I'd love to take some questions about purposeful learning. We deeply believe in meaning and context, and I will go ahead and turn it back over to my colleague, Sean Melia, and I look forward to some of the questions.
Thank you, Sean. I appreciate that. And thank you, Jason. I think we have about 3 more minutes, so let's see if we can get a question in. And this question is for Jason. And the question reads, how can I customize the learning experience / outcome for each individual student? I have such a wide range of ability levels in my classroom, and I find it challenging to work with and reach all students at their own academic levels.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sean, and thank you for that question. The Herculean task of trying to answer that in 1.5 minutes is really next to impossible. What I will say, however, is it's very difficult, and that's why a big part of what we've really advocated for, both in the work that I've been doing with districts and also in the book, Fun Learning in Action, is really looking at incremental steps. First and foremost, recognizing what your assets and strengths are right now in your classroom. This work, it's very easy to start by saying, I've got to change everything. And maybe over the course of time, that is the case. But there may be things that you're doing right now that are beginning to actually move towards personalization and strengths that you can build on. So the way that I would answer that question in the brief time that I have is start to look at the strengths of how you are conducting your instruction currently. See where there are glimpses of personalization. If you're using some one-to-one device implementation, see where you can infuse more potentially adaptive curriculum, like what Sean Mahoney was talking about. See where you can have students begin to own a little bit more of their data than they currently do. I think that what we need to do is really keep in mind this incremental process and really building on the strengths that are already potentially in action in your classes. We talk about this much more in the book, of course, but I definitely encourage you to start with your strengths and work from there.
Yeah, Jason, I couldn't agree more. So both with the fact that it's tough to answer in 1 minute, and yet, three things come to mind really quickly. One is I want to reinforce the notion you introduced, which is student as co-planner and co-creator. So really enlisting the student in that level of sort of self-regulation and your co-pilot. The second thing that I would ask folks to maybe consider is thinking about some of the ways to introduce elements of choice and control, which you alluded to. So some of the research around engagement and motivation and flow is really interesting when you're thinking about the individual student level. And then I do want to put an exclamation point next to the notion of adaptive solutions for a particular purpose. So those self-paced systems like Alex, I think about there's a really compelling report that is provided to teachers where it's by standards, by students. So I can see this is exactly where Jason is excelling. This is where he seems to have mastered the concept, and this is where I need to intervene and provide some other support or assign some remediation. So I think all three of those aspects really address your point, Jason, which is start with your strengths and build from there incrementally.
Excellent. Thanks, guys. Well, unfortunately, we are at time. An hour goes by very quickly. At this point, I want to say thanks to all the educators for joining us today, and a big thank you and shout out to Sean Mahoney and Jason Green for their continued thought leadership in the area of personalized learning. And for more information about curriculum solutions, please go to mheducation.com. Have a great day. Thank you.